High in the clouds of the Andes, the Inca built roads with no wheels, cities without mortar, and ruled an empire stretching across mountains and jungles alike. But what was life really like for the people beneath the golden sun of Inti? What happened when night fell on Machu Picchu? From sacred coca leaves to sleeping under stars with stone pillows, this is a journey through power, mystery, and moonlit rituals of an empire lost to time. Snuggle in, dear friend, and let the mountain winds carry you into dreams of ancient greatness. Subscribe for more sleepy sagas from the forgotten corners of history, and be sure to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that soothes you to sleep. Tonight, the Andes Whisper. Let's listen in the high Andes of what you know today as Peru. Sometime around the year 1200 CE, a story began that would reshape the entire western coast of South America. But like all great civilizations, the Inca Empire's beginning wasn't marked by dramatic battles or sudden conquests. Instead, it emerged from the patient, methodical organization of mountain valleys, the careful cultivation of terraced fields, and the slow accumulation of administrative wisdom that would eventually govern 12 million people across nearly 2 million square kilometers. You must understand that the Incas themselves understood their origins through sacred narratives that blended the practical with the divine. According to their most enduring creation myth, Inti, the sun god, looked down upon the chaotic world of early humanity and despaired at their lack of organization. The people wandered without purpose, without the sophisticated agricultural techniques that could sustain large populations, without the intricate social structures that could unite diverse communities under common purpose. So Inti dispatched two of his children, Manco Capac and Mama Aklo, to establish order and civilization. The divine siblings emerged from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca, carrying with them a golden rod that would guide their mission. As they journeyed northward through the harsh Andean landscape, they were instructed to test the earth wherever they stopped, where the golden rod would sink into the ground with a single thrust. There they would establish their capital city and begin the great work of civilizing humanity. This rod, according to Inca tradition, finally penetrated the earth in the valley of Cusco, in a location that provided strategic advantages that any practical administrator would immediately recognize. The Valley of Cusco, situated at approximately 11,150 feet above sea level, offered several crucial advantages for early settlement. The location provided access to multiple ecological zones within a relatively compact area: the high Puna grasslands for llama and alpaca herding, the middle elevation zones perfect for potato cultivation, and the lower valleys suitable for maize production. This vertical archipelago system, as scholars now term it, allowed a single community to access the full range of Andean resources without requiring extensive territorial expansion. Manco Capac, according to the systematic oral traditions preserved by the Incas, established himself as the first Sapa Inca, meaning unique emperor. But you should understand that his reign, like those of his immediate successors, was far more concerned with the mundane work of organization than with grand imperial ambitions. The early Inca leaders focused their attention on developing agricultural techniques that could sustain growing populations in challenging mountain environments. The cultivation of potatoes, which originated in the Andes thousands of years before Manco Capac's arrival, required sophisticated understanding of altitude, climate, and soil conditions. Different varieties of potatoes thrived at different elevations, and the early Incas had to catalog and perfect the cultivation of dozens of distinct types. At the highest elevations, they grew bitter potatoes that could withstand frost, while at middle elevations, they cultivated the sweeter varieties that would become dietary staples. The process of freeze-drying these potatoes, a technique they called chocolate, for long-term food storage that would prove crucial for supporting non-agricultural populations in later centuries. Mama Aklo, meanwhile, established the equally important traditions of textile production that would become one of the defining characteristics of Inca civilization. The domestication and breeding of llamas and alpacas provided wool of exceptional quality. But transforming this raw material into the elaborate textiles that would distinguish Inca nobility required generations of accumulated knowledge. The early women of Cusco developed spinning techniques, dyeing processes using local plants and minerals, and weaving methods that produced cloth of such fine quality that it became a form of currency throughout the Andean region. The social organization that emerged in early Cusco reflected the practical necessities of mountain agriculture combined with the administrative sophistication that would later characterize the empire. The Alu system, which the Incas inherited from earlier Andean cultures but refined and systematized, formed the foundation of their social structure. Each Alu was essentially an extended family group that shared common ancestors, maintained collective ownership of agricultural land, and organized labor cooperatively for major projects like terrace construction or irrigation system maintenance. Within the Alu, land allocation followed carefully established protocols. The community elders would survey the available agricultural terrain each year and distribute plots based on family size, with adjustments made for households that had members serving in the military or performing other state obligations. This system ensured that no family would lack access to the resources necessary for survival, while also maintaining incentives for productivity and community participation. The early rulers, after Manco Capacsinchi, Roca, Lok U Panqui Mata, Capac and Capac Yakpak, Yuv Panqui continued this patient work of internal organization and gradual territorial expansion. Their conquests, if they can be called that, were more often negotiations with neighboring Ilas to join the growing Cusco Confederation. The advantages of participation were obvious: access to the increasingly sophisticated agricultural techniques, protection from raids by less organized groups, and participation in the redistribution systems that could provide security during poor harvest years. The administrative innovations during these early centuries laid the groundwork for the empire's later expansion. The development of the Quipu system for record-keeping emerged from the practical necessity of tracking agricultural production, labor obligations, and resource distribution across multiple communities. These knotted string devices, which used different colored cords, not types, and positions to encode numerical and possibly narrative information, allowed administrators to maintain precise records without a written language. But as the Cusco Confederation grew in size and complexity during the 13th and 14th centuries, the administrative challenges multiplied exponentially. How do you maintain central coordination across communities separated by difficult mountain terrain? How do you ensure that agricultural surplus from productive regions reaches areas experiencing shortages? How do you organize labor for major public works projects while maintaining local agricultural production? These questions would require innovations that went far beyond the traditional Alu system, and the solutions developed in late 14th and early 15th centuries would transform a regional confederation into one of the most extensive empires in human history. The stage was set for transformation. But what specific innovations would allow a Mountain Valley Confederation to expand across the entire western spine of South America? The transformation of Cusco from a regional confederation into the foundation of an empire required administrative innovations that would seem almost impossibly sophisticated to observers from less organized societies. During the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Inca rulers developed systems of governance, resource management, and social control that could coordinate activities across enormous distances and diverse populations with a precision that would challenge many modern states. The key insight that enabled this transformation was the recognition that effective administration required standardization without destroying local autonomy. The Incas understood that they could not simply impose uniform practices. across the diverse ecological and cultural zones they hoped to control. Instead, they developed what you might recognize as a form of federalism, where local communities retained significant autonomy in their daily operations while contributing to benefiting from empire-wide systems of coordination and redistribution. The Middle labor system exemplified this balance between central coordination and local flexibility. Rather than imposing taxation in goods or currency, which many communities would have struggled to provide, the Incas required each Elu to contribute labor for state projects. But the specific type and timing of this labor service was carefully coordinated with local agricultural cycles and community needs. Communities in areas suitable for mining might contribute workers to gold or silver extraction, while those in regions with stone quarries would provide masons for construction projects. The rotation system ensured that no individual family would be overwhelmed by labor obligations. Adult men might serve 1 year in 3, or even 1 year in 7, depending on the community's total population and the empire's current needs. During their service, their family's agricultural plots would be maintained by their neighbors, and they would receive food, clothing, and other necessities from state stores. This system created a form of social insurance that protected families from the economic disruption that labor service might otherwise cause. The sophistication of the administrative apparatus required to coordinate this system across thousands of communities was extraordinary. The development of the Quipu recording system reached unprecedented complexity during this period. Different colored cords represented different categories of information. Golden yellow might represent stored maize. Red could indicate military personnel. Blue might denote obligations fulfilled or outstanding. The knots themselves encoded numerical values using a base 10 system, with different knot types representing units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. But the Quipus recorded more than simple numerical data. Evidence suggests they also contained narrative information, possibly genealogies, historical accounts, or even poetic compositions. The Quipuquemayoc specialists trained in creating and interpreting these records underwent years of education to master the complex symbolic system. They formed a crucial class of administrators who could maintain accurate records across the empire and ensure that resources flowed efficiently from areas of surplus to regions experiencing shortages. The storage and redistribution system that supported this administrative apparatus required infrastructure on a scale that dwarfed most contemporary civilizations. The Incas constructed thousands of colca stone warehouses designed to preserve agricultural products, textiles, and other goods in the challenging Andean climate. These structures used sophisticated ventilation systems, moisture control techniques, and pest management strategies to maintain food supplies for years at a time. Archaeological investigations of these storage facilities reveal the extraordinary scale of the system. At Huánuco Pampa, one of the major administrative centers, over 500 warehouses stored food supplies sufficient to feed thousands of people for extended periods. The variety of goods maintained in these facilities reflects the empire's integration of diverse ecological zones: potatoes and quinoa from the high mountains, maize from the middle elevations, cotton and tropical fruits from the coastal regions, and eastern slopes. The social hierarchy that emerged to coordinate these complex systems balanced traditional kin-based leadership with imperial administration. The traditional Elu leaders, called Caracas or Caracas, retained significant authority within their communities, but now reported to imperial administrators appointed by Cusco. This dual system allowed the empire to maintain detailed oversight of local activities while preserving the social relationships that motivated community cooperation. The religious integration that accompanied administrative consolidation demonstrates the Incas' sophisticated understanding of cultural politics. Rather than attempting to eliminate local religious practices, which would have generated resistance and resentment, they incorporated local deities into an expanded pantheon headed by Inti, the sun god. Local shrines and sacred sites were maintained and honored, but they were connected to imperial ceremonies and festivals that reinforced loyalty to Cusco. The Inti Raymi, or Festival of the Sun, which took place during the winter solstice, exemplified this integration. Communities throughout the empire would participate in synchronized ceremonies that honored both local agricultural cycles and the imperial calendar. These festivals served multiple functions. They reinforced social cohesion within communities, demonstrated the empire's spiritual authority, and provided opportunities for administrators to assess local conditions and address problems before they became serious. The education system that supported imperial administration required unprecedented coordination between local and imperial authorities. While most children continued to learn primarily through participation in their families' economic activities, selected individuals received specialized training in imperial administration, military leadership, or religious duties. The sons of caraca families might travel to Cusco for education in law, record-keeping, and imperial history, while daughters might be chosen for specialized roles in textile production or religious ceremonies. The transportation and communication infrastructure that enabled this administrative coordination represents one of the most impressive achievements of pre-industrial civilization. The Inca road system, which would eventually span approximately 40,000 kilometers, began as connections between Cusco and nearby allied communities, but grew into a network that linked the empire's furthest provinces. The engineering challenges involved in constructing these roads through some of the world's most difficult terrain required innovations that impressed even Spanish conquistadors centuries later. Mountain sections featured stone staircases carved directly into cliff faces, while desert segments included low walls to prevent sand from covering the roadway. River crossings utilized suspension bridges woven from ichu grass that could support loaded llama caravans, and wetland areas featured raised causeways that remained passable during flood seasons. The Chasqui messenger system that operated on these roads provided communication speeds that wouldn't be matched in the Americas until the development of the telegraph. Relay stations positioned at intervals of approximately 2.5 kilometers allowed trained runners to cover distances of 150 miles per day, carrying quipu messages, oral reports, and even fresh fish from the coast to Cusco. This system enabled imperial administrators to maintain real-time awareness of conditions throughout their territories and respond quickly to crises or opportunities. But this impressive administrative machinery was ultimately in service of expansion, and by the early 15th century, the internal organization of the Cusco Confederation had reached a level of sophistication that made external expansion not just possible, but almost inevitable. The systems developed for coordinating activities within the Confederation could be scaled up to incorporate much larger territories and populations. While the military organization and logistics capabilities that supported these systems provided the tools necessary for conquest, what specific military and diplomatic strategies would transform these administrative innovations into the foundation of continental empire? The transformation of the Inca administrative apparatus into an instrument of territorial expansion required military innovations that were as sophisticated as the bureaucratic systems that supported them. But you must understand that Inca warfare was fundamentally different from the dramatic, decisive battles that characterize many military histories. Instead, Inca expansion resembled a methodical administrative process, where military action was simply one tool among many for incorporating new territories into their growing confederation. The military organization that emerged during the late 14th and early 15th centuries reflected the same principles of systematic coordination that characterized other aspects of Inca administration. Rather than maintaining a professional standing army, which would have strained the empire's resources and potentially create a military class with interests separate from imperial administration, The Incas developed a system where military service was integrated with other labor obligations and community responsibilities. Every adult male participated in military training during his youth, learning to use traditional weapons like slings, clubs, and spears, as well as developing the physical conditioning necessary for campaign service in difficult terrain. But only a small proportion of these men would serve in active military roles. During any given year, most would fulfill their MITA obligations through agricultural labor, construction work, or other civilian activities that supported the empire's infrastructure. When military campaigns were undertaken, the forces assembled represented a cross-section of the empire's population rather than a specialized warrior class. Farmers, artisans, administrators, and local leaders all served together in units organized around their home communities. This system ensured that military forces remained closely connected to civilian society while also providing practical advantages. Soldiers familiar with local conditions could serve as guides and interpreters, while community leaders could negotiate with potential allies or enemies, using established networks of kinship and trade relationships. The logistic system that supported these campaigns demonstrates the sophistication of Inca administrative capabilities. Military expeditions could last for months or even years, requiring the coordination of food supplies, equipment, maintenance, medical care, and communication across enormous distances. The road network and storage facilities that had been developed for civilian administration provided the infrastructure necessary for these extended operations. Supply chains for military campaigns operated on principles similar to civilian resource distribution. Communities along campaign routes would contribute food, clothing, and other supplies from their local stores, with these contributions coordinated through the Quipu record-keeping system to ensure that no single community bore a disproportionate burden. Llama caravans carried supplies forward to advancing forces, while returning empty to collect additional resources from rear areas. The weapons and equipment used by Inca forces reflected the empire's integration of diverse regional traditions and resources. Slings, which were particularly effective in mountain warfare, utilized stones carefully selected and sometimes specially crafted for maximum impact. The accuracy achieved by experienced slingers was legendary. They could reliably strike targets at distances that exceeded the range of most projectile weapons available to their enemies. Clubs and axes incorporated sophisticated metallurgy using bronze alloys that provided superior durability compared to pure copper weapons used by many contemporary cultures. The empire's control over tin sources in the southern highlands gave them significant advantages in weapon production, while their administrative systems ensured that high-quality weapons reached military units regardless of their distance from production centers. But the most crucial element of Inca military strategy was their understanding that successful conquest required not just defeating enemy forces, but creating conditions where former enemies would want to join the imperial system. The benefits of incorporation into the Inca Confederation: access to advanced agricultural techniques, participation in redistribution systems, protection from raids by less organized groups had to be obvious and attractive to potential subjects. Diplomatic preparation for military campaigns often lasted longer than the actual fighting. Inca negotiators would approach target communities with offers of alliance, emphasizing the advantages of voluntary incorporation while making clear the consequences of resistance. These negotiations drew upon detailed intelligence about local political structures, economic conditions, and military capabilities gathered through trade networks, intermarriage, and other peaceful contacts. When communities agreed to join the Confederation voluntarily, the incorporation process was designed to minimize disruption to local life while establishing the administrative connections necessary for imperial coordination. Local leaders retained their positions, but now reported to imperial administrators. Local religious practices continued, but were integrated with imperial ceremonies. And local economic activities continued, but were coordinated with empire-wide distribution systems. The treatment of conquered populations reflected this. Same emphasis on integration rather than domination. While resistance certainly provoked harsh retaliation, communities that surrendered after brief resistance were typically incorporated into the imperial system with minimal punishment. The goal was to transform former enemies into loyal subjects, who would contribute to rather than undermine. Imperial strength, the early expansion campaigns that established the foundation for later. Imperial growth targeted regions that offered strategic advantages for further expansion while providing resources that would enhance imperial capabilities. The conquest of the Chancas, a powerful confederation northwest of Cusco, illustrates the sophisticated planning that characterized Inca military strategy. The Chanca Confederation posed both a threat and an opportunity for the growing Cusco state. Their military capabilities were formidable enough to challenge Inca expansion, but their territory controlled access routes toward the coast and provided agricultural resources that could support larger populations. The campaign against the Chancas required careful coordination of military action, diplomatic negotiation, and administrative integration that would serve as a model for later conquests. Intelligence gathering for this campaign utilized trade relationships, intermarriage connections, and diplomatic contacts to develop detailed understanding of Chanca political structures and military capabilities. Inca negotiators identified potential allies within the Confederation who might be persuaded to defect or remain neutral during military action. Supply lines were established to support extended operations in territory hundreds of miles from Cusco. The actual military campaign combined direct assault on Chanca strongholds with diplomatic efforts to detach allies and isolate resistance. Siege techniques developed for mountain warfare utilized the empire's sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. Water supplies could be diverted to force surrender of fortified positions, while irrigation systems could be destroyed to undermine agricultural productivity of resistant communities. The incorporation of conquered Chanca territories into the imperial system demonstrated the administrative sophistication that made Inca expansion sustainable. Rather than simply extracting tribute from defeated enemies, the Incas invested in infrastructure development that would enhance long-term productivity. New roads connected former Chanca territories to the imperial communication network. Storage facilities were constructed to participate in redistribution systems, and administrative centers were established to coordinate local activities with imperial planning. The success of the Chanca campaign provided both resources and confidence for expanded territorial ambitions. The human resources gained through conquest additional warriors, craftsmen, administrators, and agricultural workers multiplied. The empire's capabilities for future expansion. The territory gained provided strategic advantages for controlling access to different ecological zones and trade routes. But perhaps most importantly, administrative techniques refined during this campaign created templates that could be applied to much larger and more complex territorial acquisitions. The systems developed for integrating Chanca communities into imperial structures could be scaled up to incorporate entire coastal valleys, highland confederations, and even distant tropical regions with radically different environmental conditions and cultural practices. The stage was now set for the systematic expansion that would transform a regional Andean confederation into an empire spanning the entire western coast of South America. But what specific innovations in leadership and strategy would enable this unprecedented territorial expansion? And how would the administrative systems developed in the Cusco heartland adapt to govern populations counted in the millions across territories covering nearly 2 million square kilometers? To understand the true complexity of the Inca Empire, you must first grasp the intricate patterns of daily life that sustained millions of people across some of the world's most challenging terrain. The empire's strength lay not in dramatic conquests or monumental architecture, but in the methodical organization of countless mundane activities that, when coordinated across vast distances, created unprecedented prosperity and stability for Andean populations. Daily life in the Inca Empire was characterized by routines that had been refined over generations to extract maximum productivity from difficult environments, while maintaining social cohesion across diverse communities. These routines varied considerably depending on elevation, climate, and local resources, but they were unified by common principles of community cooperation, careful resource management, and integration with imperial administrative systems. In the highland communities that formed the empire's demographic and agricultural core, each day began before sunrise with activities dictated by the agricultural calendar and weather conditions. Adult men would first check on the terraced fields that represented their family's primary source of sustenance, examining irrigation channels for blockages, inspecting crop growth, and identifying any problems that required immediate attention. The precision required for successful agriculture at elevations often exceeding 12,000 feet left no room for casual oversight. The potato cultivation that sustained highland populations required constant vigilance and sophisticated technical knowledge. Different varieties had to be planted at precisely the right times to avoid frost damage, while soil preparation techniques varied depending on slope, drainage, and previous crop rotations. The freeze-drying process that preserved potatoes for long-term storage, shuko, that could last for years required careful timing to take advantage of nighttime freezing and daytime thawing cycles that only occurred during specific seasonal conditions. Women's daily routines centered around the agnostic activities that transformed raw agricultural products into the food, clothing, and other goods necessary for family survival. The preparation of meals began early each morning with the grinding of maize or quinoa and the selection of preserved foods from family storage areas. Cooking techniques had been developed to maximize nutrition from limited ingredients while conserving fuel in regions where wood was scarce. The spinning and weaving that occupied much of women's time represented one of the empire's most sophisticated technologies. The production of textiles from llama and alpaca wool required skills that took years to master. From the initial selection and preparation of fibers through the complex dyeing processes that created the distinctive colors associated with different regions and social classes, a single high-quality textile might require months of work. But these garments served as both practical clothing and stores of value that could be traded or contributed to imperial tribute requirements. Children's participation in these daily routines began almost as soon as they could walk. Young children assisted with simple agricultural tasks like scaring birds from growing crops or collecting fuel for cooking fires. As they grew older, they gradually learned the skills they would need as adult boys accompanying their fathers to learn farming, herding, and construction techniques, while girls worked alongside their mothers to master domestic crafts and food preparation. The Alu kinship system that organized these communities provided both a social framework for success, for daily activities, and the connection to imperial administration. Each Alu typically consisted of several hundred people spread across multiple generations, all claiming descent from common ancestors and sharing collective responsibility for territorial resources. The social obligations within an Alu were precisely defined but flexible enough to accommodate the varying circumstances that individual families might face. Land allocation within each Alu followed established protocols that balanced family needs with community resources. The community's elders would meet annually to review population changes, assess agricultural conditions, and redistribute plots as necessary. Families with new children might receive additional land, while those who had lost members might surrender plots for redistribution. The system ensured that every family had access to sufficient resources for survival while maintaining incentives for productivity and community participation. Labor cooperation within Elis extended far beyond individual family activities. Major agricultural projects like terrace construction, irrigation system, maintenance, or harvest activities required coordinated community effort. The scheduling of these collective activities had to balance the needs of different families while ensuring that essential work was completed at optimal times. The social mechanisms that coordinated these activities: community meetings, traditional leadership hierarchies, and reciprocal obligation systems represented sophisticated forms of democratic organization that preceded European contact by centuries. The integration of ALU activities with imperial, administrative requirements added additional layers of complexity to daily routines. Communities had to maintain detailed records of population, agricultural production, and resource availability that could be reported to imperial administrators through the quipu system. The accuracy of these records was crucial for determining tribute obligations, organizing labor service, and requesting assistance during periods of shortage. The Chasqui messenger system that connected each community to the imperial communication network required constant maintenance and coordination. Each ilu was responsible for maintaining relay stations within its territory, providing food and shelter for messengers, and ensuring that trained runners were available when needed. This system allowed news and instructions to travel from Cusco to the most distant provinces within days, but it required the cooperation of thousands of communities to function reliably. Religious observances that punctuated daily and seasonal cycles served multiple functions within ALU communities. Regular ceremonies honoring local deities and ancestral spirits reinforced social cohesion while connecting communities to imperial religious practices. The timing of these ceremonies was coordinated with agricultural activities. Planting and harvest festivals marked crucial transitions in the farming calendar while providing opportunities for work communities to assess their circumstances and plan for future needs. The mummification and veneration of deceased community members represented one of the most distinctive aspects of Inca social organization. Preserved ancestors remained active participants in community life, consulted for important decisions, and honored with regular offerings. The maintenance of ancestral mummies required significant community resources and provided another link between daily activities and broader cultural traditions. Storage and distribution systems within each community had to balance current consumption needs with long-term security requirements. Families maintained private stores of food, clothing, and other goods, but they also contributed to community warehouses that could provide assistance during emergencies. The management of these storage systems required careful planning and community coordination to ensure that resources remained available when needed. The craft production that supplemented agricultural activities varied depending on local resources and community specializations. Some Alis became known for producing particular types of pottery, textiles, or tools that could be traded with other communities or contributed to imperial tribute requirements. The skills required for these specialized crafts were typically passed down through family lines, creating hereditary occupations that provided community, identity, and economic security. The seasonal migrations that characterized many highland communities added additional complexity to daily routines. Families might maintain households at different elevations, moving periodically to take advantage of varying agricultural seasons or to access different resources. The coordination required for these movements determining timing, organizing transportation, and maintaining multiple residences required sophisticated planning and community cooperation. The relationship between individual communities and imperial administrators was mediated through local leaders who had to balance community needs with imperial requirements. These leaders faced the constant challenge of ensuring that their communities fulfilled tribute obligations while maintaining the autonomy necessary for local decision-making. Their success in managing these relationships often determined whether their communities prospered under imperial rule or faced difficulties that could threaten their survival. But as communities grew larger, imperial administrative requirements became more complex. The traditional Alu system faced challenges that required innovative solutions. How could communities maintain social cohesion while participating in economic systems that connected them to regions thousands of miles away? How could local autonomy be preserved while meeting the standardization requirements of imperial administration? These questions became increasingly urgent as the empire expanded beyond the traditional Andean heartland into regions with different environmental conditions and cultural traditions. The answers developed during the empire's period of greatest expansion would require administrative innovations that went far beyond traditional community organization, creating bureaucratic systems of unprecedented sophistication and scope. The administrative sophistication that enabled the Inca Empire to govern 12 million people across nearly 2 million square kilometers required bureaucratic innovations that would challenge the capabilities of many modern states. The systems developed by Inca administrators for collecting information, making decisions, and implementing policies represented one of the most impressive achievements of pre-industrial government. Creating coordination mechanisms that functioned reliably across enormous distances and diverse populations without written language or wheeled transportation. The hierarchical administrative structure that governed the empire balanced central coordination with local autonomy through a carefully designed system of nested authorities. At the apex stood the Sapa Inca, whose authority was considered divine, and whose decisions carried the force of religious law. But the practical administration of the empire was delegated through multiple levels of officials, who possessed both local knowledge and imperial perspective. The territorial organization of the empire reflected sophisticated understanding of both geographical realities and administrative requirements. The empire was divided into 4 Sayasincha Suyu, Anti-Suyu, Kala Suyu, and Kunta Suyu radiating outward from Cusco-like quarters of a circle. Each Suyu encompassed diverse ecological zones and populations, but they were unified by transportation, networks, and administrative systems that could coordinate activities across vast territories. Within each Suyu, authority was further delegated through provincial governors, who oversaw multiple local communities while reporting to imperial administrators in Cusco. These governors faced the complex challenge of implementing imperial policies while adapting them to local conditions and maintaining the cooperation of community leaders. Their success required diplomatic skills, administrative competence, and detailed knowledge of both imperial law and local custom. The Caracas system that connected imperial administration to local communities represented one of the most innovative aspects of Inca government. Acaras were hereditary leaders of Alu communities, who retained their traditional authority while also serving as imperial officials. This dual role allowed them to represent community interests to imperial administrators, while also ensuring that imperial policies were implemented effectively at the local level. The responsibilities of Caracas encompassed virtually every aspect of community life that intersected with imperial administration. They collected tribute obligations, organized labor service, maintained census records, coordinated religious ceremonies, and adjudicated disputes that fell within their jurisdictions. The success of the entire imperial system depended on their ability to balance these multiple roles while maintaining the trust and cooperation of their communities. The training and selection of administrative officials required educational systems that could produce individuals capable of managing complex governmental responsibilities. While most education remained informal and focused on practical skills, the empire maintained schools for training administrators, record keepers, and other specialists. These schools taught not only practical skills like quipu interpretation and mathematical calculation, but also the imperial history, religious knowledge, and cultural understanding necessary for effective governance. The quipu record-keeping system that supported imperial administration represented one of the most sophisticated information management technologies developed by any pre-literate civilization. These devices, consisting of colored cords with knots tied in specific patterns, could encode numerical data, calendrical information, and possibly even narrative content with precision that allowed for empire-wide coordination of complex activities. The construction of quipus required specialized knowledge and considerable skill. Different colored cords represented different categories of information. Gold and yellow might indicate stored maize. Red could represent military personnel, while blue might denote completed labor obligations. The knots themselves encoded numerical values using a base-10 system, with different knot types representing units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. The position of knots along each cord indicated their numerical significance, allowing for the recording of precise quantities. But quipus recorded much more than simple numerical data. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that these devices could also contain genealogical information, historical narratives, legal codes, and even poetic compositions. The quipucamayokes who created and interpreted these records underwent years of training to master the symbolic systems and memory techniques necessary for their work. The maintenance and distribution of quipu records required administrative infrastructure that extended throughout the empire. Each major administrative center maintained archives of quipus documenting local conditions, tribute obligations, population changes, and other information relevant to imperial governance. Copies of crucial records were maintained at multiple locations to prevent loss, while specialized messengers transported updated information between administrative centers. The census system that provided demographic information for imperial planning represented one of the most impressive applications of quipu technology. Imperial administrators maintained detailed records of population organized by age, gender, occupation, and productive capacity. These records allowed for precise calculation of tribute obligations, labor service requirements, and military recruitment potential for each community throughout the empire. The taxation system that supported imperial operations was based primarily on labor service rather than payment in goods or currency. But this required even more sophisticated record-keeping than monetary taxation would have demanded. Administrators had to track not only the total labor obligations of each community, but also the specific types of work required, scheduling of service periods, and the compensation provided to workers and their families during service periods. The MITA labor system that organized these obligations was carefully designed to avoid disrupting local economic activities while providing the human resources necessary for imperial projects. Communities would be assigned specific types of work based on their geographical locations and local specializations. Those near quarries might provide construction workers, while communities in agricultural regions might supply laborers for state farms or road maintenance. The scheduling of MITA obligations required coordination across multiple administrative levels to ensure that labor was available when needed without overwhelming individual communities. Imperial planners had to balance the timing of major construction projects with agricultural seasons, coordinate the movement of workers across long distances, and ensure that adequate food and housing were available at work sites. The storage and redistribution system that supported these labor obligations required infrastructure and coordination on an unprecedented scale. The empire maintained thousands of kulka stone warehouses designed to preserve food, textiles, tools, and other goods in the challenging Andean climate. These storage facilities were strategically located along transportation routes and near administrative centers to facilitate efficient distribution. The management of these storage systems required detailed record-keeping that tracked not only the quantities of goods stored, but also their quality, age, and intended distribution. Administrators had to ensure that perishable goods were used before they spoiled, that strategic reserves were maintained for emergencies, and that distribution matched the actual needs of communities throughout the empire. The legal system that governed imperial administration operated without written laws but maintained consistency through carefully trained officials and standardized procedures. The Okoyuriko inspectors who traveled throughout the empire to monitor local administrators and resolve disputes represented the empire's commitment to uniform application of imperial law, regardless of local variations in custom or practice. These inspectors possessed authority to investigate complaints, punish misconduct, and modify local practices that conflicted with imperial policy. Their effectiveness depended on their ability to understand both imperial law and local conditions, and their reports provided crucial feedback to central administrators about the effectiveness of imperial policies in diverse circumstances. The communication system that connected all levels of imperial administration relied on the Chosky messenger network that operated along the empire's extensive road system. These trained runners could carry messages, small goods, and kipu records across enormous distances with remarkable speed and reliability. The relay stations that supported this system were maintained by local communities as part of their tribute obligations. But the coordination required to maintain effective communication across such vast territories represented a remarkable administrative achievement. The integration of religious and civil administration reflected the Inca understanding that effective governance required both practical competence and spiritual authority. Imperial officials were typically involved in religious ceremonies that reinforced their authority while connecting local communities to imperial institutions. The coordination of religious festivals across the empire required the same administrative skills that were used for organizing labor service or coordinating military campaigns. But this sophisticated administrative machinery faced constant challenges that tested its adaptability and effectiveness. How could centralized coordination be maintained as the empire expanded into regions with different environmental conditions and cultural traditions? How could the record-keeping systems that worked effectively for Quechua-speaking populations be adapted to govern communities that spoke different languages and followed different customs? The solutions developed during the empire's period of greatest territorial expansion would require innovations that pushed the boundaries of pre-industrial administrative capability, creating governmental systems that would influence Andean political organization for centuries after the empire's collapse. The physical infrastructure that supported Inca administration and daily life across their vast empire required engineering solutions that overcame some of the most challenging geographical obstacles found anywhere on Earth. The roads, bridges, agricultural terraces, storage facilities, and urban centers constructed by Inca engineers represented innovations that impressed even European observers who arrived with their own sophisticated construction techniques and materials. The Inca road system, known as the Capacone, extended approximately 40,000 kilometers across terrain that included snow-covered mountain peaks, arid deserts, tropical rainforests, and coastal plains. This network was not simply a collection of trails connecting important locations, but rather a carefully planned transportation system designed to move people, goods, and information efficiently across the entire empire, while overcoming geographical obstacles that would challenge modern engineers. The construction techniques used for different sections of the road network were adapted to local conditions and materials while maintaining consistent standards for width, durability, and accessibility. In mountainous regions, roads were typically paved with precisely fitted stone blocks that could withstand freeze-thaw cycles and heavy traffic. The stones were shaped and positioned to create surfaces that provided secure footing for both human travelers and llama caravans, while channeling water runoff to prevent erosion in areas where the terrain was too steep for conventional road construction. Inca engineers carved staircases directly into cliff faces or constructed stone ramps that zigzagged up slopes. These solutions required enormous amounts of labor and sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, but they created transportation routes that remained functional for centuries after their construction. Desert sections of the road network faced different challenges that required equally innovative solutions. In sandy areas, low stone walls were built along both sides of roads to prevent drifting sand from blocking passage. These walls were positioned to channel wind patterns in ways that kept roads clear while also creating protected areas, where travelers could rest and take shelter from sandstorms. The bridge construction that connected roads across rivers, gorges, and other obstacles represented some of the most impressive achievements of Inca engineering. Suspension bridges woven from ichu grass and other fibers could span distances of over 100 meters, while supporting loaded llama caravans and large groups of travelers. The construction of these bridges required sophisticated understanding of materials science, structural engineering, and the environmental conditions that would affect bridge durability. The maintenance of these bridges required constant attention from local communities who were responsible for replacing worn components, inspecting structural integrity, and clearing debris that might interfere with safe passage. The knowledge required for this maintenance was passed down through generations of specialists who understood the complex techniques required for working with natural fiber materials. Stone bridges were constructed in locations where permanent structures were required and suitable materials were available. These bridges utilized arch construction techniques and precisely fitted stonework that created structures capable of withstanding earthquakes, floods, and centuries of heavy use. The engineering principles used in these constructions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural loads, foundation requirements, and the expansion and contraction that would occur under varying temperature conditions. The agricultural terracing systems that supported Inca food production represented perhaps the most extensive landscape modification undertaken by any pre-industrial civilization. Millions of terraces were constructed across the Andean mountains, converting steep slopes into productive agricultural land while preventing erosion and managing water resources with remarkable efficiency. The construction of these terraces required detailed understanding of soil science, hydrology, and agricultural techniques adapted to high-altitude conditions. Each terrace was built with carefully designed drainage systems that could handle both irrigation, water, and seasonal rainfall without causing erosion or waterlogging. The stone retaining walls that supported these terraces were constructed using techniques that created flexible structures capable of adjusting to ground movement without collapsing. The irrigation systems that supplied water to these terraced fields represented sophisticated hydraulic engineering adapted to challenging mountain conditions. Water was diverted from streams and springs through carefully constructed channels that maintained proper flow rates, while distributing water evenly across multiple terrace levels. The engineering calculations required to design these systems had to account for seasonal variations in water availability, the water requirements of different crops, and the need to prevent both drought and flooding. The urban planning and construction that created Inca administrative centers and ceremonial sites demonstrated architectural sophistication that rivaled contemporary European cities. Cusco, the imperial capital, was designed as a carefully planned urban center that reflected both practical administrative requirements and symbolic representations of imperial power and religious authority. The stonework that characterized Inca architecture utilized construction techniques that created structures of remarkable durability and earthquake resistance. The precisely fitted blocks that formed building walls were shaped and positioned without mortar, relying instead on careful engineering that distributed structural loads while allowing for the flexibility necessary to survive seismic activity. The tools and techniques required for this precision stonework had been developed over generations of accumulated experience and represented sophisticated understanding of materials and structural engineering. The water management systems that supplied Inca cities and agricultural areas required engineering solutions adapted to the challenging conditions of high-altitude environments. Aqueducts, fountains, drainage systems, and reservoirs were constructed using techniques that ensured reliable water supply while preventing the freeze damage that could occur during cold seasons. the storage facilities that supported Inca redistribution. Systems were designed to preserve food and other goods in climatic conditions that could range from tropical humidity to high-altitude, cold, and dryness. The kulkas that stored agricultural products utilized ventilation systems, moisture control, techniques, and structural designs that could maintain stable internal conditions regardless of external weather variations. The construction of these storage facilities required understanding of food preservation techniques, building materials suitable for different climatic conditions, and architectural principles that would ensure long-term durability. The location of these facilities along transportation routes required coordination between engineering considerations and administrative requirements for efficient distribution. The mining operations that provided metals for tools, weapons, and decorative objects required engineering solutions for working in high-altitude conditions with limited oxygen and extreme weather variations. The techniques developed for extracting and processing gold, silver, copper, and tin represented sophisticated understanding of geology, metallurgy, and the logistics required to transport materials across difficult terrain. The tools and equipment used in these mining operations were designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing the physical demands placed on workers, who had to perform difficult labor at high altitudes. The transportation of extracted materials to processing centers and manufacturing locations required coordination between mining operations and the road network that connected production areas to population centers, the textile production facilities that created the high-quality cloth that served as both practical goods and stores of value required engineering solutions for processing animal fibers under varying climatic conditions. The drying, spinning, weaving, and dyeing processes that transformed raw materials into finished textiles had to be adapted to environments that ranged from dry highlands to humid valleys. The integration of all these infrastructure systems required coordination and planning that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of systems engineering principles. Roads had to connect not only population centers, but also agricultural areas, mining sites, and strategic locations. Storage facilities had to be positioned to support both local needs and empire-wide redistribution. Urban centers had to accommodate both administrative functions and the ceremonial activities that reinforced imperial authority. But this remarkable infrastructure development faced constant challenges as the empire expanded into new territories with different environmental conditions, available materials, and construction requirements. How could engineering techniques developed for highland conditions be adapted to coastal deserts or tropical rainforests? How could construction projects be coordinated across territories that might be separated by thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain? The solutions developed during the empire's period of greatest expansion would test the adaptability and innovation of Inca engineering while creating infrastructure systems that would influence Andean civilization for centuries. After the empire's political collapse, the transformation of the Cusco Confederation from a regional power into the foundation of a continental empire began not with grand imperial ambitions, but with a crisis that threatened the very survival of the Inca state. The events surrounding the Chanca invasion and the emergence of Pachacati as a military and administrative innovator marked the beginning of systematic territorial expansion that would eventually encompass the entire western coast of South America. During the reign of Viracocha Inca in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the political situation in the central Andes had become increasingly unstable. Climate variations that affected agricultural production, population pressures that strained traditional resource-sharing systems, and the growing military capabilities of various competing confederations created conditions that made conflict virtually inevitable. The Inca state, despite its administrative sophistication and territorial consolidation around Cusco, remained vulnerable to military pressure from larger and more aggressive neighbors. The Chanca Confederation, based in The region northwest of Cusco represented the most formidable military threat that the Incas had yet faced. The Chancas controlled territory that provided access to diverse ecological zones, maintained military traditions that emphasized aggressive expansion, and possessed the demographic resources necessary to field armies that could overwhelm smaller neighbors through sheer numerical superiority. Their political organization, while less sophisticated than the Inca administrative system, was sufficient to coordinate military campaigns across considerable distances and maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The intelligence reports that reached Cusco through trade networks and diplomatic contacts indicated that the Chancas were preparing for a major military campaign aimed at establishing their dominance over the entire central Andean region. Their strategy appears to have been based on the assumption that rapid conquest of key centers would force surrounding communities to submit rather than face similar destruction. The capture of Cusco, with its strategic location and accumulated wealth, would serve as both a practical victory and a symbolic demonstration of Chanca power. Viracocha, Inca's initial response to these reports reflected the caution and diplomatic preference that had characterized traditional Inca statecraft. Rather than preparing for immediate military confrontation, he attempted to negotiate arrangements that might avoid warfare while preserving Inca independence. These negotiations involved offers of tribute payments, territorial concessions, and alliance arrangements that would have acknowledged Chanca superiority while maintaining some degree of Inca autonomy. The failure of these diplomatic initiatives became apparent when Chanca forces began advancing toward Cusco with clear intentions of conquest rather than negotiation. The size and organization of the invading force made it obvious that the Chancas intended to eliminate Inca independence entirely rather than accept any compromise arrangement that would leave potential rivals in position to challenge their dominance. In the future, the military preparations undertaken by the Inca state in response to the approaching crisis revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their existing systems. The administrative efficiency that had been developed for managing agricultural production, labor service, and resource distribution could be rapidly adapted to coordinate defensive preparations. Communities throughout the Confederation could be mobilized to contribute warriors, weapons, food supplies, and logistical support with remarkable speed and effectiveness. But the military organization itself remained based on traditional patterns that were better suited to small-scale conflicts between neighboring communities than to the large-scale warfare that confrontation with the Chancas would require. Inca military forces consisted primarily of farmers and craftsmen performing temporary military service rather than specialized warriors with extensive combat experience. Their weapons and tactics reflected the needs of mountain warfare between relatively small forces rather than the pitched battles between large armies that major territorial expansion would demand. The approach of Chanca forces toward Cusco created political tensions within the Inca leadership that reflected broader disagreements about appropriate strategies for dealing with external threats. Viracocha Inca's preference for diplomatic solutions and strategic withdrawal, if necessary, represented one perspective that emphasized preservation of the existing Inca state, even if it required accepting subordinate status to more powerful neighbors. The alternative perspective, championed by one of Viracocha Inca's sons, who would later take the name Pachacati, emphasized military resistance and the systematic development of capabilities that could not only defeat immediate threats but also prevent similar crises in the future. This approach required accepting greater immediate risks but offered the possibility of achieving security through strength rather than through accommodation with hostile neighbors. The political crisis that developed as Chanca forces approached Cusco ultimately resulted in Viracocha Inca's withdrawal from active leadership and the emergence of Pachacati as the effective military commander of Inca forces. This transition reflected not simply disagreement about military strategy, but fundamental differences in vision about the future direction of Inca development and the methods necessary to ensure long-term survival and prosperity. Pachacuties. Assumption of military leadership coincided with the implementation of innovations in organization, tactics, and strategy that would transform not only the immediate military situation, but also the entire character of the Inca state. The recruitment of additional warriors from allied communities, the development of new weapons and tactical formations, and the creation of intelligence networks that could provide detailed information about enemy movements represented immediate adaptations to military necessity. But the more significant changes involved systematic analysis of the political and military factors that had created the crisis and the austere development of long-term strategies that would prevent similar threats from emerging in the future. Pachacuti and his advisors recognized that the Inca state's vulnerability resulted not simply from military weakness, but from the broader political fragmentation of the Andean region that allowed aggressive powers like the Chancas to threaten all of their neighbors. The Battle of Yawar Pampa, where Inca forces under Pachacuti's leadership decisively defeated the Chanca army, marked not only the resolution of the immediate crisis, but also the beginning of a systematic campaign of territorial correal expansion that would continue for the next century. The victory demonstrated that Inca military innovations could overcome numerically superior enemies, while the treatment of defeated Chanca populations established precedents for the integration of conquered territories that would characterize all subsequent expansion. The administrative changes that followed the Chanca victory reflected Pachacuti's understanding that military success had to be supported by governmental innovations that could manage larger territories and more diverse populations. The traditional ALU system and confederation arrangements that had governed the Cusco region were adequate for coordinating activities among related communities, sharing similar cultures and economic systems, but they were insufficient for managing an empire that would eventually span multiple climate zones, language groups, and cultural traditions. The territorial reorganization that created the four sayas radiating outward from Cusco provided the administrative framework necessary for systematic expansion while maintaining central coordination of imperial policy. Each SU would eventually encompass territories larger than most contemporary European kingdoms, but they were designed as manageable administrative units that could be governed through consistent policies and procedures. The military reforms that accompanied these administrative changes reflected lessons learned during the Chanca conflict about the requirements for successful warfare against large and well-organized enemies, the creation of specialized military units, the development of standardized weapons and tactics, and the establishment of logistic systems that could support extended campaigns in distant territories transformed the Inca military from a confederation defense force into an instrument of systematic conquest. The integration of conquered Chanca territories and populations into the expanding Inca state established procedures and principles that would guide subsequent territorial expansion, rather than simply extracting tribute from defeated enemies or ruling them as subject peoples. The Incas developed comprehensive integration policies that transformed former enemies into imperial citizens with both obligations and benefits under imperial law. But these innovations, while successful in resolving the immediate crisis and establishing the foundation for imperial expansion, also created new challenges and opportunities that would shape the next phase of Inca development. How could the administrative and military systems developed for governing highland Andean populations be adapted to control coastal deserts, tropical valleys, and other environmental zones with completely different conditions and requirements? The administrative and military innovations implemented by Pachacuti following the successful defense against Inca invasion represented far more than responses to immediate military necessity. Instead, they constituted a systematic reimagining of governmental organization that would enable the coordination of activities across unprecedented territorial scales, while maintaining the social cohesion and economic productivity that had characterized the original Cusco Confederation. Pachacuti's approach to imperial organization reflected sophisticated understanding of the administrative challenges that large-scale territorial expansion would create. The traditional systems that had proven effective for governing related communities within a relatively compact geographical area would require fundamental modifications to coordinate diverse populations separated by enormous distances and environmental barriers. The solutions developed during his reign established the governmental framework that would enable his successors to extend Inca control across the entire Andean region and beyond. The territorial reorganization that created the Four Sayas was based on careful analysis of geographical, cultural, and administrative factors that would affect imperial governance, rather than simply expanding outward from Cusco in all directions. Without systematic planning, Pachacuti and his advisors designed an administrative structure that could accommodate future territorial acquisitions while maintaining efficient coordination between central authority and local administration. Chinche Sioux, the northwestern Sioux, was oriented toward the coastal regions and northern highlands that offered opportunities for territorial expansion, while providing access to resources that were scarce in the Cusco heartland. The administrative center established at Huanaco Pampa was positioned to coordinate activities across diverse ecological zones while serving as a base for further expansion toward the coast and into the northern mountains. Antisuyu, the northeastern Sioux, encompassed the transition zone between the highland areas and the tropical regions of the eastern slopes and Amazon basin. The administrative challenges in this region were particularly complex because of the environmental differences between highland and lowland areas and the cultural diversity of populations that had adapted to these varying conditions. The development of governance systems that could coordinate highland and lowland communities while respecting their different economic systems and social organizations required innovations that went beyond traditional Andean administrative practices. Calasuyu. The southeastern Sioux included the Altiplano region around Lake Titicaca and extended southward toward what would eventually become Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. This region contained some of the most productive agricultural areas in the empire, as well as important mineral resources. But it also included populations with strong military traditions and well-developed political organizations that would require careful diplomatic and administrative management. Kunta Sioux, the southwestern Sioux, was oriented toward the coastal regions that offered entirely different environmental conditions and economic opportunities than the highland areas that had been the original foundation of Inca power. The integration of coastal populations with their sophisticated irrigation systems, urban centers, and craft specializations would require administrative flexibility that could accommodate radically different ways of organizing economic and social life. The military reorganization that accompanied this territorial restructuring reflected lessons learned during the Chanca conflict about the requirements for systematic territorial expansion. The creation of permanent military units organized around the decimal system squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, and armies of 10,000 provided the organizational framework necessary for coordinating large-scale military operations while maintaining the flexibility required for diverse, tactical situations. The recruitment system that supplied personnel for these military units was integrated with the middle labor obligations that provided workers for other imperial projects, rather than creating a separate military class that might develop interests conflicting with imperial policy. Pachacuti designed a system where military service was simply one form of the community service that all imperial subjects were expected to provide. This approach ensured that military forces remained closely connected to civilian society while also providing practical advantages for logistics, intelligence and post-conflict administration, the weapons standardization that accompanied military reorganization represented a significant departure from traditional Andean practices where each community produced its own military equipment according to local customs and available materials. Imperial workshops were established to produce standardized weapons, armor, and other military equipment that could be distributed to military units regardless of their geographical origins. This standardization improved tactical coordination, while also demonstrating the empire's capacity to organize production and distribution on unprecedented scales. The logistics systems developed to support extended military campaigns required innovations in transportation, communication, and supply management that would serve as models for all subsequent imperial administration. The expansion of the road network to connect military bases, supply depots, and administrative centers created infrastructure that served both military and civilian purposes, while demonstrating imperial power and organizational capability to both subjects and potential enemies. The intelligence gathering systems that provided information about potential targets for expansion, political conditions in neighboring territories, and military capabilities of potential enemies required the development of networks that extended far beyond imperial boundaries. Trade relationships, diplomatic contacts, intermarriage connections, and other peaceful interactions were systematically utilized to gather information that would inform strategic planning and tactical preparations. The siege warfare techniques that were refined during campaigns against fortified positions reflected sophistication, understanding of engineering principles adapted to Andean conditions, the diversion of water supplies, construction of earthworks to isolate defensive positions, and coordination of assault forces represented military innovations that were informed by the same engineering expertise that had created the empire's agricultural terraces and transportation infrastructure, the diplomatic procedures that were used to offer incorporation opportunities to potential targets before resorting to military conquest reflected Pachacuti's understanding that successful expansion required not just defeating enemies, but creating conditions where former enemies would become loyal imperial subjects. The standardization of these procedures ensured that expansion would follow consistent principles while allowing for flexibility in addressing the specific circumstances of different regions and populations. The integration policies that were applied to newly conquered territories established procedures that would characterize imperial expansion throughout the remainder of Inca history, rather than simply imposing imperial control over subject populations. These policies were designed to transform conquered territories into integral parts of the empire where former enemies would have incentives to support rather than resist imperial authority. The relocation programs that moved selected populations from newly conquered territories to established regions of the empire while moving reliable imperial subjects into recently acquired areas served multiple purposes simultaneously. These programs reduced the risk of rebellion by disrupting local leadership networks and community solidarity that might support resistance, while also spreading imperial culture and administrative practices to new territories. The religious integration policies that incorporated local deities into the imperial pantheon while emphasizing the supremacy of imperial religious practices reflected sophisticated understanding of cultural politics, rather than attempting to eliminate local religious traditions, which would have generated resistance and resentment. Imperial policies sought to create religious synthesis that honored local traditions, while establishing clear connections to imperial authority and Cusco as the supreme religious center. The educational programs that brought selected individuals from conquered territories to Cusco for training in imperial administration, military leadership, and religious practices created networks of local leaders who understood both traditional community needs and imperial requirements. These programs ensured that territorial expansion would be supported by administrative personnel who could facilitate integration, while serving as bridges between local and imperial interests. The tribute systems that were established in newly conquered territories were carefully designed to provide resources for continued expansion, while avoiding economic disruption that might undermine local productivity or generate resistance. Rather than simply extracting wealth from subject populations, tribute obligations were integrated with redistribution systems that provided benefits to contributing communities while supporting imperial projects that served empire-wide interests. The record-keeping innovations that were required to administer this increasingly complex system led to significant developments in quipu technology and the training of specialists who could maintain accurate information about conditions throughout the empire. The expansion of administrative personnel and the standardization of procedures created governmental capabilities that were unprecedented in the pre-Columbian Americas and rivaled those of contemporary civilizations in other parts of the world. But the success of these administrative and military innovations also created new challenges and opportunities that would require continued adaptation and development. How could systems designed for governing highland Andean populations be modified to control coastal civilizations with completely different environmental conditions, economic systems, and cultural traditions? How could imperial expansion be continued without overwhelming the administrative capabilities that had made initial success possible? The reign of Tupac Inca Yupanqui, who succeeded Pochackety around 1471 CE, marked the transition from the foundational phase of imperial expansion to the systematic consolidation of territorial gains that would transform the Inca Empire into the largest political entity in the pre-Columbian Americas. Tupac Inca's conquests, which extended imperial control from modern-day Ecuador to central Chile, required administrative and military innovations that could manage territories encompassing virtually every environmental zone found in South America. The strategic planning that characterized Tupac Inca's campaigns reflected the maturation of imperial administrative capabilities and the systematic application of lessons learned during earlier expansion efforts. Rather than pursuing opportunistic conquests or responding to immediate threats, imperial planners during his reign developed comprehensive strategies for territorial acquisition that considered long-term administrative requirements, resource needs, and strategic advantages that would support continued expansion. The northern campaigns that brought the kingdoms of Quito and surrounding regions under imperial control represented the most complex territorial integration challenge that the empire had yet faced. These regions contained well-established urban centers, sophisticated agricultural systems, and political organizations that had successfully maintained independence for centuries. The incorporation of these territories required diplomatic and administrative innovations that went far beyond the military conquest strategies that had proven sufficient for earlier expansion. The Kingdom of Quito, centered in what is now Ecuador, possessed military capabilities and political organization that made simple conquest impractical without enormous costs in resources and personnel. The rulers of Quito had developed defensive strategies based on their understanding of highland warfare tactics, while their control over diverse ecological zones provided the economic foundation necessary to sustain prolonged resistance to external pressure. Tupac Inca's approach to the Quito campaigns combined traditional military pressure with sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering, designed to isolate resistance while encouraging defection among potential opponents. Intelligence networks that had been developed during earlier campaigns provided detailed information about political divisions within the Kingdom of Quito, while trade, relationships, and intermarriage connections created opportunities for negotiation with local leaders who might be persuaded to support imperial expansion in exchange for favorable treatment under imperial administration. The siege of Quito itself demonstrated the advanced military engineering capabilities that had been developed. During previous campaigns, imperial forces utilized sophisticated techniques for controlling water supplies, constructing earthworks to isolate defensive positions, and coordinating multi-directional assault strategies that could overcome even well-fortified positions. But the ultimate success of the campaign depended as much on political factors as on military superiority, the willingness of significant portions of the local population to accept imperial rule rather than continue costly resistance. The integration of Quito and surrounding territories into the imperial administrative system required innovations that addressed the challenges of governing sophisticated urban populations with different cultural traditions and economic systems. The traditional Alu-based administration that had proven effective in rural highland communities was inadequate for managing complex urban societies with specialized crafts, extensive trade networks, and administrative traditions that differed significantly from those developed in the Cusco region. The administrative solutions developed for war governing newly acquired northern territories established precedents that would be applied throughout the remainder of imperial expansion. Local administrative structures were preserved where they were compatible with imperial requirements, while imperial officials were appointed to oversee activities that required coordination with empire-wide policies. This dual system allowed for local autonomy in matters that primarily affected individual communities while ensuring imperial coordination of activities that had broader significance. The coastal campaigns that extended imperial control over the sophisticated civilizations of Peru's Pacific coast represented an entirely different set of challenges that required military and administrative adaptations to environmental conditions that were completely unlike the highland regions, where imperial power had originally developed. The coastal valleys, with their intensive irrigation agriculture, dense urban populations, and specialized craft production, offered enormous economic opportunities but also required governmental approaches that could manage complexity that exceeded anything the empire had previously encountered. The Chima Kingdom, based in the Mocha and Chicama valleys of northern Peru, represented the most formidable coastal power and the most sophisticated challenge to imperial expansion that Tupac Inca would face. The Chima had developed urban centers that rivaled any in the Americas, agricultural systems that supported dense populations in desert environments, and craft production capabilities that created goods that were traded throughout Western South America. The military campaigns against the Chima required tactical innovations that could operate effectively in desert conditions, while overcoming defensive strategies based on control of scarce water resources. Imperial forces had to adapt highland warfare techniques to coastal conditions while developing logistical capabilities that could maintain supply lines across difficult terrain between highland bases and coastal operational areas. The siege techniques that ultimately forced Chima submission demonstrated sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and the vulnerabilities of irrigation-dependent agricultural systems. Rather than attempting to storm well-fortified urban centers, imperial forces concentrated on gaining control of irrigation infrastructure that supplied water to Chima agricultural areas and population centers. The disruption of these water supplies created conditions where continued resistance became economically unsustainable regardless of military capabilities. The incorporation of Chima's territories and populations into the imperial system required administrative innovations that could manage the most complex urban and economic systems that the empire had yet encountered. Chima craft production, trade networks, and administrative traditions represented valuable resources that could contribute to imperial strength if they were properly integrated. But their complexity required governmental approaches that went far beyond the systems that had been adequate for rural highland communities. The preservation of Chima administrative expertise while establishing imperial oversight represented one of the most sophisticated examples of the integration policies that characterized Inca expansion. Rather than replacing local administrators with imperial appointees who lacked relevant experience, imperial policy sought to create hybrid systems, where local knowledge and imperial coordination could be combined to maximize both local productivity and imperial benefit. The southern campaigns that extended imperial control into what would become Bolivia. Chile and northwestern Argentina represented the empire's expansion into territories that were geographically similar to the original highland, core but culturally and politically distinct. These regions contained populations that shared some cultural traditions with the Cusco region while maintaining independent political organizations and local customs that required diplomatic and administrative sensitivity. The conquest of the Cola and Lupaca peoples around Lake Titicaca demonstrated the empire's capacity to integrate populations that possessed military traditions and political organizations that could have supported prolonged resistance. The success of these campaigns depended on the empire's ability to offer benefits that exceeded the costs of resistance while demonstrating military capabilities that made continued independence impractical. The extension of imperial control into Chile required adaptations to environmental conditions that tested the flexibility of imperial, administrative, and military systems. The Central Valley of Chile offered agricultural opportunities that could contribute to imperial resources. But the distance from imperial centers and the different environmental conditions required innovations in transportation, communication, and local administration. The establishment of the southern frontier at the Mall River represented not a failure of imperial expansion, but a rational decision about the limits of sustainable territorial control. The costs of maintaining effective administration and military control over territories beyond this point would have exceeded the benefits that such expansion could provide. While the populations in these regions possessed military capabilities that would have required enormous resources to overcome, the administrative consolidation that accompanied these territorial acquisitions required systematic development of governmental capabilities that could coordinate activities across the expanded empire while maintaining the efficiency and responsiveness that had characterized earlier imperial administration. The expansion of the road network, the multiplication of administrative centers, and the training of additional administrative personnel represented investments in infrastructure and human resources that were necessary to make territorial expansion sustainable. The demographic policies that managed population distribution across the expanded empire reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between territorial control and settlement patterns. The relocation programs that moved reliable populations into recently conquered territories while bringing selected groups from new regions. Two established areas served multiple purposes in maintaining imperial security while facilitating cultural resilicating. Cultural integration. But the success of Tupac Inca's expansion also created new challenges that would test the empire's adaptive capabilities during subsequent reigns. The management of territories that encompassed virtually every environmental zone in South America, populations that spoke dozens of different languages, and economic systems that ranged from pastoral nomadism to intensive urban crafts required administrative innovations that pushed the boundaries of pre-industrial governmental capacity. How would the empire's administrative and military systems adapt to govern this unprecedented diversity while maintaining the central coordination that had made territorial expansion possible? The answers developed during the reign of Tupac Inca's successor would determine whether the empire could continue to grow and prosper, or whether the challenges of managing continental-scale diversity would overwhelm its governmental capabilities. The reign of Huayna Capac, which began around 1493 CE and continued until his death in 1525, marked both the pinnacle of Inca imperial achievement and the beginning of the internal contradictions that would make the empire vulnerable to external threats that previous generations of rulers had successfully overcome. Huayna Capac's ruleverse saw the empire at its greatest territorial extent, governing approximately 12 million people across nearly 2 million square kilometers. But it also coincided with administrative and political challenges that tested the limits of pre-industrial governmental capabilities. The territorial extent of the empire during Huayna Capac's reign encompassed virtually every major ecological zone in western South America, from the tropical rainforests of the Amazon basin to the arid deserts of the Pacific coast, from the high grasslands of the Altiplano to the temperate valleys of central Chile. This environmental diversity provided enormous economic advantages through access to resources that could not be obtained within any single climate zone. But it also created administrative challenges that strained even the sophisticated governmental systems that had been developed during previous reigns. The population diversity that characterized the mature empire required administrative innovations that could accommodate dozens of different languages, cultural traditions, and economic systems, while maintaining the central coordination necessary for imperial functionality. The integration policies that had proven successful for incorporating highland Andean populations into the imperial system required constant adaptation and refinement when applied to coastal urban civilizations, tropical forest societies, and other groups whose traditional ways of life differed significantly from those of the original Cusco Confederation. The military challenges that faced the empire during Capac's reign reflected both the success of previous territorial expansion and the increasing difficulty of extending imperial control beyond the limits of sustainable administration. The northern campaigns that attempted to extend imperial control into what would become Colombia encountered populations with military traditions and political organizations than the empire had previously faced, while the southern frontiers faced pressure from groups that had learned from earlier encounters with imperial forces. The economic management of the mature empire required coordination of resource flows across distances and new environmental barriers that challenged even the sophisticated transportation and communication systems that had been developed. During earlier expansion, the redistribution of goods between tropical and highland regions, the coordination of labor service across territories separated by thousands of kilometers, and the maintenance of strategic reserves for military campaigns and emergency relief demanded administrative capabilities that operated at the limits of pre-industrial technology. The demographic policies that managed population distribution across the empire faced increasing challenges as territorial expansion reached its practical limits while population growth continued within established regions. The relocation programs that had successfully facilitated integration during earlier expansion phases became more difficult to implement as suitable territories for settlement became scarce and as established communities developed resistance to policies that disrupted traditional settlement patterns. The succession crisis that developed during the latter part of Capac's reign reflected structural problems in imperial political organization that had been manageable during periods of rapid expansion, but became increasingly problematic as territorial growth slowed and internal competition for resources intensified. The traditional system of selecting rulers from among qualified members of the royal family worked effectively when there were abundant opportunities for ambitious individuals to distinguish themselves through military conquest or administrative achievement, but it became a source of instability when such opportunities diminished. The civil war that erupted between Huascar and Atahualpa following Capac's death in 1525 represented far more than a simple succession dispute between rival claimants to imperial authority. Instead, it reflected fundamental disagreements about imperial policy, administrative priorities, and the future direction of imperial development that had been developing throughout the mature phase of imperial history. Huascar's support base was concentrated in the traditional highland regions that had formed the original foundation of imperial power, and his political program emphasized policies that would preserve and strengthen the administrative and cultural traditions that had enabled imperial success. His supporters generally favored continued emphasis on agricultural production, traditional craft specializations, and the administrative systems that had proven effective for governing highland populations. Atahualpa's political coalition drew more heavily from the northern regions that had been incorporated during the later phases of imperial expansion. And his program reflected the interests and perspectives of populations that had different relationships with traditional imperial institutions. His supporters were generally more interested in policies that would accommodate regional diversity and provide greater autonomy for local administration, while maintaining imperial coordination of activities that required empire-wide cooperation. The military conflict between these rival factions consumed resources and attention that had previously been devoted to maintaining imperial administration and defending imperial frontiers. The diversion of military forces from frontier defense to internal conflict created opportunities for external enemies to probe imperial defenses and plan strategies for challenging imperial authority. The disruption of administrative systems created shortages and inefficiencies that undermined imperial prestige while reducing the economic advantages that had motivated community support for imperial authority. The devastation caused by epidemic diseases that spread throughout the empire during the early 16th century created demographic and economic challenges that overwhelmed imperial administrative capabilities regardless of political leadership. The population losses from smallpox, measles, and other diseases introduced through contact with European explorers and traders disrupted traditional labor systems, reduced agricultural production, and created social instability that made effective governance increasingly difficult. The timing of these epidemic outbreaks, which coincided with the succession crisis and civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa, created a convergence of challenges that tested imperial resilience in ways that no previous crisis had demanded. The administrative systems that had successfully managed previous challenges were designed to coordinate activities among healthy populations during periods of political stability, not to respond to simultaneous demographic catastrophe, civil war, and external threats. The intelligence reports that reached imperial administrators about European activities along the Pacific coast during the 1520s indicated potential threats that required strategic planning and resource allocation at precisely the time when internal conflicts were consuming imperial attention and capabilities. The small size of initial European expeditions may have encouraged imperial leaders to underestimate the significance of this new challenge, while their preoccupation with internal political competition prevented the systematic response that previous external threats had received. The diplomatic initiatives that European explorers attempted during their initial contacts with imperial representatives occurred in political contexts that made effective negotiation extremely difficult. Imperial officials were uncertain about their authority to make agreements that might affect the outcome of the ongoing succession dispute, while European representatives lacked understanding of imperial political structures and cultural traditions that would have been necessary for meaningful communication. The technological advantages that European expeditions possessed in military equipment, transportation, and disease resistance were not immediately apparent to imperial observers, who had successfully dealt with previous external challenges through combinations of military action, diplomatic negotiation, and administrative integration. The assumption that these new challenges could be managed through traditional methods may have contributed to strategic decisions that proved inadequate when the actual capabilities of European forces became clear. The internal divisions that the Civil War had created within imperial political and military leadership made coordinated response to external challenges extremely difficult even after the extent of European capabilities became apparent. Communities and regional leaders who had supported different factions during the succession crisis were reluctant to cooperate in defensive efforts that might strengthen their former opponents, while imperial military forces remained divided by loyalties developed during the internal conflict. The breakdown of imperial administrative systems that had maintained coordination across the empire created conditions where local communities increasingly focused on their immediate survival rather than empire-wide resistance to external threats. The disruption of transportation networks, communication systems, and redistribution mechanisms reduced the practical benefits of imperial membership while increasing the costs of maintaining traditional obligations. But even as these internal Challenges mounted and external threats became increasingly serious. The fundamental strengths that had enabled imperial success remained largely intact. The agricultural systems that supported imperial populations continued to function effectively in most regions. The engineering infrastructure that connected imperial territories remained operational, and the cultural traditions that had motivated community cooperation retained their significance for most imperial subjects. The question that would determine the empire's fate was whether these underlying strengths could be mobilized effectively enough to overcome the immediate crises that threatened imperial survival, or whether the convergence of challenges would overwhelm imperial adaptive capabilities before effective responses could be developed and implemented. The arrival of Francisco Pizarro's expedition on the Pacific coast of Peru in 1532 coincided with the Inca Empire at its moment of greatest vulnerability. When internal civil war, demographic catastrophe from epidemic diseases, and administrative breakdown had created conditions that would allow a force of fewer than 200 European soldiers to systematically dismantle a governmental system that had successfully coordinated the activities of 12 million people across nearly 2 million square kilometers for over a century. The Spanish conquest strategy that Pizarro implemented reflected sophisticated understanding of imperial political structures and the specific weaknesses that internal conflicts had created. Rather than attempting to conquer imperial territories through conventional military campaigns that would have required far larger forces and resources than his expedition possessed, Pizarro focused on capturing and controlling imperial leadership while exploiting the divisions that civil war had created among different factions and regions. The intelligence gathering that preceded direct Spanish intervention in imperial affairs provided detailed information about the political situation, military capabilities, and economic resources that would determine the feasibility of conquest attempts. Spanish contact with imperial subjects through earlier explorations, trade relationships, and diplomatic encounters had created opportunities to assess imperial strengths and inform strategic planning for the conquest expedition. The timing of Spanish intervention, which occurred while Atahualpa was consolidating his victory in the civil war against Huascar, provided tactical advantages that might not have been available during periods of imperial stability. Atahualpa's forces were dispersed across considerable distances to maintain control over territories that had supported his rival, while his political authority remained contested in regions that had opposed him during the succession conflict. The tactical innovations that Spanish forces employed during their initial encounters with imperial military units reflected both European technological advantages and adaptive strategies developed through earlier experiences with indigenous American societies. The combination of firearms, steel weapons, cavalry, and coordinated infantry tactics provided significant advantages in direct combat, while psychological warfare techniques that emphasized Spanish technological superiority and divine support were designed to undermine indigenous morale and confidence. The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, represented a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of imperial political structures and the paralyzing effects that the removal of central authority could have on hierarchical governmental systems. The ambush that eliminated thousands of imperial attendants while capturing the Sapa Inca alive created conditions where imperial military forces throughout the empire were uncertain about legitimate authority and unable to coordinate effective resistance. The ransom negotiations that followed Atahualpa's capture provided Spanish forces with unprecedented access to imperial wealth while creating time for additional Spanish reinforcements to arrive and for political divisions within the empire to deepen. The enormous quantities of gold and silver that were collected to secure Atahualpa's release demonstrated both imperial wealth and the continued loyalty that imperial subjects maintained toward legitimate authority even under desperate circumstances. The execution of Atahualpa in July 1533 despite the payment of the agreed ransom, represented a calculated political decision that eliminated the possibility of imperial restoration under legitimate leadership while creating martyrdom that would inspire resistance movements for generations. The Spanish justification for this execution, based on charges of plotting rebellion and practicing idolatry, reflected European legal and religious concepts that had little relationship to imperial political traditions or legal systems. The march toward Cusco that followed Atahualpa's execution demonstrated Spanish ability to exploit imperial transportation infrastructure while managing the complex political relationships that territorial conquest required. The utilization of imperial roads, storage facilities, and administrative centers provided logistical advantages that would have been impossible without the sophisticated infrastructure that previous imperial expansion had created. The collaboration of imperial subjects who supported Spanish conquest reflected both pragmatic assessments of political realities and strategic calculations about potential advantages that could be obtained through cooperation with the new authorities. Communities that had opposed Atahualpa during the Civil War may have viewed Spanish intervention as an opportunity to improve their political positions, while others may have concluded that cooperation offered better prospects for survival than resistance. The capture of Cusco in November 1533 provided Spanish forces with control over the symbolic and administrative center of imperial authority, while demonstrating their capacity to overcome even the most significant imperial strongholds. The systematic looting of imperial palaces, temples, and storage facilities provided enormous wealth for Spanish participants while eliminating the material resources that could have supported continued imperial resistance. The installation of puppet rulers who claimed legitimate imperial authority while serving Spanish interests represented sophisticated political strategy that attempted to maintain continuity with imperial traditions while ensuring Spanish control over governmental decisions. Manco Inca, who was initially installed as Sapa Inca under Spanish oversight, possessed legitimate claims to imperial authority that could potentially legitimize Spanish rule while providing administrative expertise for governing indigenous populations. The administrative systems that Spanish colonial authorities attempted to establish in place of imperial governmental structures reflected both Spanish colonial experience in other regions and specific adaptations to Andean conditions and populations. The encomienda system that granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities and their labor represented a villa servient fundamental transformation of traditional relationships between authorities and subjects that had characterized imperial administration. The exploitation of imperial infrastructure for Spanish colonial purposes demonstrated both the durability of Inca engineering achievements and the ways that conquering powers could utilize existing systems for their own objectives. Spanish colonial administration utilized imperial roads for military control and commercial transportation, converted imperial storage facilities for colonial economic activities, and adapted imperial administrative centers to serve colonial governmental functions. The resistance movements that developed in response to Spanish colonial policies reflected both loyalty to imperial traditions and practical opposition to colonial exploitation that exceeded anything imperial subjects had previously experienced. The rebellion led by Manco Inca from his stronghold at Vilcabamba represented the most significant attempt to restore imperial authority and demonstrated that imperial governmental traditions retained legitimacy and support among significant portions of the indigenous population. The siege of Cusco and Lima that Manco Inca's forces mounted during peace 1536 to 1537 demonstrated sophisticated military organization and strategic planning that utilized traditional imperial capabilities while adapting to the military challenges that Spanish colonization presented. The coordination of indigenous forces across considerable distances and the maintenance of siege operations for extended periods indicated that imperial administrative and logistical capabilities had not been completely destroyed by the conquest. The failure of these resistance efforts reflected both Spanish military advantages and the internal divisions among indigenous populations that colonial policies had deepened. The collaboration of some indigenous communities with Spanish colonial authorities provided intelligence, logistical support, and military assistance that undermined resistance efforts. While Spanish tactical innovations and technological advantages proved decisive in crucial engagements, the gradual elimination of independent indigenous authority that occurred during the decades following the initial conquest represented systematic Spanish policy designed to prevent any restoration of effective indigenous political organization. The execution of successive indigenous leaders, the relocation of populations away from traditional centers, and the destruction of imperial records and cultural symbols were intended to make imperial restoration impossible regardless of indigenous desires for political independence. The demographic catastrophe that continued throughout the 16th century created conditions where indigenous populations lacked the numerical strength necessary for effective resistance, even if political unity could have been achieved. The population decline that reduced indigenous numbers by perhaps 90% within a century of Spanish arrival eliminated the human resources that had supported imperial administration while creating desperate conditions that made mere survival more important than political resistance. But despite the systematic destruction of imperial political authority and the devastating impacts of conquest and colonization, many aspects of imperial civilization proved remarkably resistant to Spanish efforts at cultural transformation. Agricultural techniques, craft traditions, religious practices, and social organizations that had characterized imperial society continued to influence Andean life throughout the colonial period and beyond. How would these surviving elements of imperial civilization interact with Spanish colonial institutions? And what legacies of imperial achievement would continue to shape Andean societies long after the empire's political collapse had become irreversible? The collapse of Inca imperial authority and the establishment of Spanish colonial rule in the mid-16th century marked not the end of Andean civilization, but rather its transformation into new forms that combined indigenous traditions with European institutions, creating cultural and social patterns that would influence South American development for centuries. The enduring legacies of imperial achievement proved remarkably resilient, even under conditions of systematic colonial suppression. While indigenous populations developed innovative strategies for preserving essential elements of their traditional way of life within drastically changed political and economic circumstances, the agricultural systems that had sustained imperial populations and enabled territorial expansion continued to provide the foundation for Andean economic life throughout the colonial period and beyond. The sophisticated terracing techniques, irrigation systems, and crop management practices that had been refined over generations of imperial development could not be easily replaced by European agricultural methods, particularly in highland regions, where environmental conditions required specialized knowledge that Spanish colonists initially lacked. The preservation of traditional agricultural knowledge occurred primarily through indigenous communities that maintained responsibility for food production even under colonial authority. Spanish colonial administrators recognized that disrupting indigenous agricultural practices would threaten the economic productivity that colonial exploitation depended upon. While indigenous communities understood that demonstrating continued agricultural competence provided practical arguments for maintaining some degree of local autonomy, the Middle labor system that had organized community service under imperial administration was adapted by Spanish colonial authorities to provide workers for mining operations, construction projects, and other colonial economic activities. While the colonial version of Mita involved far more coercive and exploitative practices than imperial labor service had entailed, The basic organizational principles and administrative procedures reflected continuity with imperial governmental traditions. The adaptation of imperial administrative practices to colonial purposes demonstrated both the effectiveness of traditional organizational methods and the ways that conquering powers could utilize existing systems for their own objectives. Spanish colonial officials found that many imperial administrative procedures were more effective for managing indigenous populations than European methods that had been developed for different cultural and environmental conditions. The quipu, record-keeping systems that had maintained imperial administrative records, continued to be used by indigenous communities throughout the colonial period, despite Spanish efforts to replace them with European writing systems. The knowledge required for creating and interpreting quipus was preserved by indigenous specialists who recognized that these traditional information management texts remained superior to European alternatives for many local administrative purposes. The religious syncretism that developed during the colonial period reflected indigenous strategies for preserving essential spiritual traditions while accommodating Spanish demands for Christian conversion. Traditional Andean deities were often identified with Catholic saints, while indigenous ceremonial practices were adapted to coincide with Christian festivals, creating religious forms that satisfied colonial authorities while maintaining continuity with imperial spiritual traditions. The architectural and engineering legacies of imperial achievement continued to influence Andean development long after political independence had been eliminated. Spanish colonial authorities utilized imperial roads, bridges, and urban infrastructure for their own purposes, while often finding that imperial engineering standards exceeded their own capabilities for construction and maintenance under Andean conditions. The urban planning principles that had guided imperial city development influenced Spanish colonial urban design, particularly in highland regions where environmental conditions required adaptations that indigenous architects had already perfected. The integration of residential, administrative, and ceremonial functions within carefully planned urban environments provided models that Spanish colonial planners found more appropriate for Andean conditions than European urban design traditions. The craft traditions that had produced the sophisticated textiles, metalwork, pottery, and other goods that had distinguished imperial civilization continued under colonial rule, though often adapted to serve colonial markets and purposes. Indigenous artisans found that maintaining traditional craft skills provided economic opportunities within colonial society, while preserving cultural traditions that connected them to their imperial heritage. The textile production that had been one of the most highly developed aspects of imperial technology remained an important economic activity throughout the colonial period and beyond. The techniques for processing alpaca and llama wool, the dyeing methods that created distinctive colors, and the weaving skills that produced high-quality cloth continue to represent important sources of income for indigenous communities while maintaining cultural practices that had characterized imperial society. The demographic recovery that eventually occurred after the catastrophic population decline of the 16th century was facilitated by traditional agricultural and social organizational practices that had enabled indigenous populations to adapt to challenging environmental conditions throughout their history. The community cooperation systems, resource-sharing mechanisms, and environmental management techniques that had supported imperial expansion provided foundations for gradual population recovery under colonial conditions. The cultural resistance movements that developed during the colonial period often drew upon imperial historical traditions and political concepts for inspiration and legitimacy. The memory of imperial achievement provided models for indigenous political organization and sources of identity that could motivate resistance to colonial oppression. While imperial governmental traditions offered alternatives to colonial political structures that indigenous leaders could advocate as superior forms of social organization, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion of 1780 to 1781 which represented the most significant indigenous uprising during the colonial period, drew explicitly upon imperial, historical traditions and claimed legitimacy through descent from imperial rulers. The rebellion's political program combined demands for restoration of indigenous political autonomy with critiques of colonial economic exploitation that reflected both imperial political concepts and practical experience of colonial oppression. The independence movements that eventually eliminated Spanish colonial rule in the early 19th century inherited both Spanish colonial governmental structures and indigenous political traditions that had been preserved throughout the colonial period. The new Republican governments that replaced colonial administration faced the challenge of creating political systems that could accommodate the cultural and economic diversity that had characterized both imperial and colonial society. The archaeological preservation of imperial architectural and engineering achievements provided physical reminders of indigenous capabilities that challenged European assumptions about indigenous cultural inferiority. Spanish colonial authorities often found it difficult to explain the obvious sophistication of imperial construction and engineering when their ideological justifications for colonial domination were based on claims of European cultural superiority. The linguistic preservation of Quechua and other indigenous languages that had been integrated into imperial administrative systems enabled the transmission of cultural knowledge and historical memory throughout the colonial period and beyond. Despite Spanish efforts to impose European languages, indigenous communities maintained linguistic traditions that connected them to their imperial heritage while providing means for preserving traditional knowledge and cultural practices. The geographical knowledge that imperial expansion had accumulated about South American environmental conditions, resource locations, and transportation routes continued to influence regional development long after imperial political authority had been eliminated. Spanish colonial exploration and economic development often followed patterns that had been established by imperial territorial expansion, while indigenous knowledge about local conditions remained essential for successful adaptation to Andean environments. The integration of imperial legacies with Spanish colonial institutions created distinctive Andean cultural forms that influenced subsequent South American development in ways that extended far beyond the territories that had been directly governed by imperial authority. The administrative practices, agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and social organizational methods that had characterized imperial civilization contributed to regional cultural patterns that remained distinctive from both European traditions and other indigenous American societies. The modern nations that eventually emerged from the wandered territories that had been governed by the Inca Empire continue to reflect the influence of imperial achievement in their cultural traditions, economic practices, and political institutions. The boundaries of contemporary Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and parts of Chile, Argentina, and Colombia correspond roughly to imperial territorial divisions, while indigenous populations in these regions maintain cultural practices that can be traced to imperial traditions. The recognition of imperial achievement by modern scholars and the general public has contributed to growing appreciation for indigenous American capabilities and the sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations. The engineering marvels, administrative innovations, and cultural achievements that characterized imperial civilization have become sources of national and regional pride that challenge historical narratives that emphasized European cultural superiority and indigenous incapacity. The ongoing archaeological investigation of imperial sites continues to reveal new evidence of the complexity and sophistication of Andean civilization, while indigenous communities work to preserve and revitalize cultural traditions that connect them to their imperial heritage. These efforts represent not simply antiquarian interest in the past, but practical approaches to addressing contemporary challenges. Through application of traditional knowledge and cultural practices that have proven effective over centuries of adaptation to Andean conditions, The story of the Inca Empire thus represents not a concluded historical episode, but rather a continuing influence on South American development that connects past achievements with present possibilities and future aspirations. The systematic organization, environmental adaptation, and cultural integration that enabled imperial success continue to offer insights and inspiration for addressing the challenges of governing diverse populations across difficult terrain, while maintaining social cohesion and economic prosperity in one of the world's most challenging geographical regions.